Welcome to the Graduated Thoughts Podcast.
So, picture this. It is 1850,
Okay.
and you are looking at a damp, kind of shaded patch of woods on the edge of a southern plantation.
Right.
An elderly black woman walks into the trees, and it's early, just as the morning dew is settling.
So she's out there before the rest of the world is really awake.
Exactly. But she isn't just taking a leisurely stroll, and she definitely isn't just, foraging for random weeds to throw into a stew.
Not at all.
She is actively reading the landscape. Like, she is examining the bark of the trees, the moisture in the soil, the root systems under her feet.
And she's doing it with this incredible precision.
Right. The exact same rigorous analytical framework that a modern biochemist uses to read a molecular compound.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Because she is assembling a life-saving, deeply spiritual pharmacy for her entire community.
It gives me chills just thinking about the weight of that responsibility.
I know, me too. And that's what we are exploring today in this deep dive, a reality that, honestly, it fundamentally reshapes American medical history.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because we are looking at the profound, the very dangerous, and the vastly overlooked role of Black women as the ultimate preservers of African American healing traditions.
Yeah. And the scope of what we are covering today is just, well, it's staggering when you lay it all out.
It is. We are examining the lives and the actual methodologies of midwives, elder healers, root doctors, and voodoo queens.
Women who operated completely in the shadows of a brutally oppressive society.
Right, utilizing whatever materials they could scrape together just to build an autonomous system of care.
And to guide us on this, we are pulling from an incredible stack of sources for this deep dive.
Oh yeah, we have a really rich reading list today.
We do. We're looking at African-American folk healing, African-American slave medicine, jambalaya, the Conjure Workbook, and Mojo Workin'.
Which are all fantastic texts.
Absolutely. But to be clear with you, the listener, our mission today is not to just rattle off a list of historical herbal remedies.
No, we are definitely not giving you a 19th century recipe book.
Right. The goal is to uncover exactly how these specific women used this highly complex blend of spiritual labor, intergenerational teaching, and just immense physical care work.
Because that's how they sustain their people against seemingly insurmountable odds.
Yeah. So to really understand that, I feel like we have to establish what, folk healing actually meant in this specific context.
That is so important. Because the modern commercialized understanding of words like conjure or hoodoo is, well, it's heavily distorted.
Oh, massively. I mean, the popular imagination immediately jumps to Hollywood tropes, right?
Spooky curses, bubbling cauldrons, that kind of thing.
Yeah, like people practicing dark magic in a swamp for nefarious purposes.
Exactly. But the reality found in these historical texts is that for these communities, folk healing was a daily practical necessity.
It wasn't magic, it was survival.
Right. It was a primary mechanism for survival in a world that was quite literally designed to crush them.
Yeah. And one of our sources actually introduces a framework from a theologian named Lee Butler that completely changes how you look at this.
Oh, the resistance culture concept.
Yes. He calls this practice a resistance culture. And he argues that resistance isn't always like a protest in the public square.
No, sometimes resistance is the act of maintaining a completely separate way of knowing.
Right. It is building this internal culture that stands firmly against the status quo just to avoid total dehumanization.
That framework is really the key to unlocking all of this. Because consider the medical reality for marginalized people at the time, specifically enslaved African Americans
Right.
and later freedmen.
It is non-existent. Or worse.
Right. They were almost entirely excluded from formal institutional medicine. And when they did interact with white institutional medicine, it was frequently haphazard or actively harmful.
Yeah, the texts show that enslaved people were often subjected to experimental medical care by white doctors who didn't even view them as fully human.
Exactly. They were treated as capital, as property to be repaired for labor, not as human beings deserving of holistic care.
So if that's the system you're facing, relying on your own practitioners, keeping your own medical knowledge alive, is literally a matter of life and death.
It absolutely was.
So they essentially built a shadow healthcare system from scratch.
A completely parallel universe of care.
Because when the formal sanction system denies you access or views your body merely as a tool for economic output, you don't have another choice.
Right. And what stands out in the Conjure Workbook is how incredibly subtle this resistance was.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't always some elaborate midnight ritual in the woods.
No, it was woven directly into mundane, daily chores.
Like the yard sweeping. The text talks about the specific way women would sweep their yards from daylight until dark.
Or how they would rigorously clean the bottoms of their shoes before crossing a threshold.
Right, to keep out tricks.
Yeah. The source material highlights a practitioner reflecting on her childhood. She notes that what her mother brushed off as, quote, just mama's funny ways, was in fact hoodoo.
Wow, so she was hiding it from her own kids, in a way.
Yeah, or just normalizing it. The mother would make everyone take their shoes off at the door and clean the soles before carrying them inside.
And to an outside observer, like a plantation overseer or a later white employer, this just looks like a woman being fastidious about domestic dirt.
Exactly. It just looks like cleaning.
Yeah.
But internally, within the cultural framework of the family, the main concern was blessing the home
Right, establishing a peaceful environment.
and ensuring the family was protected from negative spiritual or physical interference crossing the threshold.
You know, when you hear about that level of integration between the physical and the spiritual, it really makes you wonder how they managed the cognitive dissonance.
What do you mean?
Well, like, how do you separate this deeply sacred work from the grueling, forced physical labor they had to perform every single day?
The answer is that they refused to separate it.
Really?
Yeah. This brings us to another foundational concept explored in the text's embodied spirituality.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So, African-American folk healing views the human person holistically. It insists on unifying the body, the soul, the community, and an ever-present divine.
Right, whereas Western medicine, even today, we tend to compartmentalize everything.
We do. We send you to a physician to fix your body, a therapist to talk about your mind, and a religious figure for your soul.
But in this resistance culture, those elements are inextricably linked.
Exactly. You cannot heal the physical symptom without addressing the spiritual and communal rupture that caused it.
And when you think about embodied spirituality, think about how modern Western medicine still struggles with this.
Oh, absolutely.
We're just now beginning to deeply understand how trauma physically lives in the nervous system.
Yes, how chronic stress literally changes your cellular biology.
But these women understood the mind-body connection a century before modern science popularized the term psychosomatic.
They lived it. If the dominant society is trying to define your body as nothing more than a unit of agricultural labor, then treating your own body as something sacred is revolutionary.
It's intimately connected to the divine. It is the ultimate act of rebellion.
We actually see a perfect illustration of this everyday practical resistance in the Wayne State University folk archives.
Oh, the story about Miss Essie.
Yes, Mrs. Essie and her husband utilized folk healing concepts to essentially draw an invisible perimeter around themselves.
Right. They maintained what they called getaway money.
Exactly. And this wasn't about leading a violent rebellion or anything.
No, it was tied to the sheer, exhausting effort to survive, to set positive boundaries around their own capacity to care for themselves.
So, sweeping your yard in a specific pattern to clear energy, making a medicinal tea from bark you gathered, keeping a secret stash of money.
These are all highly synchronized acts of claiming sovereignty over your own body and your own home.
And that sovereignty flew completely under the radar of racist technologies and surveillance.
Because it just looked like domestic labor.
Right. But internally, it was understood as maintaining spiritual and physical boundaries. It was a silent, daily way of declaring, you do not own this space and you do not own my spirit.
But there is a huge logistical hole in this shadow healthcare system that we need to address.
Okay, what is it?
If this entire parallel universe of medicine is operating, who is running the clinics? Who are the chief medical officers? Because the historical texts point directly to the women who acted as the primary care providers for the entire community.
The granny and the midwife.
Yes. On plantations, and subsequently in freedmen communities, the granny or the midwife was universally the first person sought out when sickness struck.
They were the absolute bedrock of physical survival.
And the scope of their practice extended far beyond what we consider modern midwifery, right?
Oh, infinitely beyond.
Yeah.
African-American women dominated the early history of obstetrics in the United States.
Which is an incredible fact on its own.
They were frequently delivering both black babies in the quarters and white babies in the enslavers' houses.
But as the texts make clear, they were not just birth attendants.
No, they were root women, master herbalists, and spiritual ritualists, all rolled into one.
So a well-stocked midwife's cabinet was an entire pharmacy and a psychiatric clinic combined.
That's a great way to put it. She didn't just know the mechanics of turning a breech baby,
Right, she knew the precise roots, herbs, and corresponding prayers to help a childless couple conceive.
or to restore a man's vitality, or to ease the psychological terror of living under a brutal regime.
She was managing the holistic health of the entire social fabric.
And in the context of folk healing, power and authority were not determined by the patriarchal structures of the dominant white society.
That's a huge point. The sources emphasize that women controlled the psychosocial environment of birth and caretaking.
Right. When a family member was dying of a fever, the community did not care about the gender or the formal education of the healer.
No, they cared about efficacy.
They relied on a healer's past record of success. If a granny had a proven track record of pulling people back from the brink of death, she wielded immense social power.
Wait, I need to stop you there, though.
Sure.
If a midwife is operating outside of formal institutions, using what the texts call intuition or motherwit, how did the community justify putting their lives in her hands?
That's a fair question.
Like, if someone I love is gravely ill, my modern instinct is to seek out a medical degree, not just intuition. How do we reconcile this reliance on an internal, unwritten knowledge base?
Well, we reconcile by understanding what motherwit actually meant to them.
Okay.
It is a concept that appears constantly across these sources. Motherwit is not simply guessing.
Right, it's not just taking a shot in the dark.
Exactly. It refers to intuitive, divinely imparted knowledge. It is often described by practitioners as a form of common sense that transcends basic logic.
Like a deep spiritual awareness of how the natural world and the human body interact?
Yes, it is an education derived from a completely different paradigm than a university lecture hall.
There is a quote from a Black midwife in Alabama that illustrates this so powerfully.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
Yeah, she practiced from the 1930s all the way into the late 1970s. And an interviewer asked her who taught her the specific technique of performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on an infant who wasn't breathing.
And her response is just incredible.
She said, quote, "No, ma'am, I hadn't been taught how to do that. I progressed that out of my mind, my own mind. There was a higher power and God give me wisdom. Motherwit, common sense, wisdom come from on high."
I progressed that out of my mind.
Yeah.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates how these women views their own agency.
They viewed themselves as conduits for a divine source of knowledge, activated precisely in critical moments of life and death.
And they blended this profound spiritual intuition with incredibly specific and sometimes perplexing physical actions.
Which actually brings us to the story of Granny Ya.
Yes, the 86-year-old treater and former midwife documented in the texts.
Her methods really challenge our modern sensibilities.
They do. Because if she assessed that a woman of childbearing age was at risk of miscarrying, she wouldn't prescribe a hormone or a modern bed rest regimen.
No, she would tie a red rag around the woman's waist.
Right. Granny Ya explained, quote, "I put a red rag around them and I hold the baby there."
She also used strips of red cloth to treat children with asthma or an overgrown liver.
Yeah. And to anyone trained in contemporary physiology, a strip of red cloth does nothing biologically.
Nothing at all. So how is this not just desperation masquerading as medicine?
Well, we have to analyze the mechanism of the ritual itself.
Okay.
We cannot separate the physical intervention from the psychological impact. Modern psychoneuroimmunology provides a clear lens for this.
Oh, right. Because we know that the human immune system and the body's physiological stability are directly compromised by cortisol, the stress hormone.
Exactly. And an enslaved person or marginalized person living under Jim Crow exists in a state of chronic, severe hypercortisolism.
Because their environment is inherently dangerous 24/7.
Right. So when Granny Ya, a deeply respected elder with an aura of spiritual authority, arrives to treat a terrified pregnant woman, her very presence alters the environment.
She's creating a localized sanctuary.
Precisely. The act of tying the red rag, a color historically associated with vitality, blood, and life force in many African traditions, is a potent symbol.
Right. It communicates to the patient that she is seen, that intervention is happening, and that a higher power is being invoked for her protection.
And this tangible act of care drastically lowers the patient's anxiety and cortisol levels.
Which in turn reduces the physiological stress on the uterus, potentially preventing stress-induced contractions.
Exactly. Granny Ya was masterfully manipulating the psychosocial environment to force a physiological outcome.
Wow. So the ritual itself is a biological intervention.
It absolutely is.
But even with a masterful understanding of psychology, there is a logistical problem here that we have to unpack.
What's that?
Well, it was illegal for enslaved people to learn how to read and write, and families were constantly violently separated at auction blocks. So how on earth does a botanical and spiritual pharmacopoeia this complex survive and evolve without a single written textbook?
It survived through the discipline of the oral textbook.
The oral textbook.
Yeah. This knowledge was not freely shared. It was fiercely guarded by the true old tradition practitioners.
You couldn't just casually ask for their botanical secrets.
No, absolutely not. It was transmitted through rigorous, deliberate apprenticeships, most typically matrilineal, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter.
And the Works Progress Administration narratives, the WPA interviews conducted in the 1930s with formerly enslaved people, they reveal a staggering volume of highly specific botanical mechanics.
They really do. These weren't just vague suggestions to drink some tea.
No, they were harvesting white sassafras root and boiling it to treat fevers.
And we should look at the biology of why they chose sassafras. It isn't random.
No, sassafras contains safrole, which induces diaphoresis, heavy sweating.
Right. And if someone is suffering from a dangerous fever, inducing a sweat breaks the fever.
So they were utilizing the chemical properties of the local biome perfectly.
They also heavily utilized pennyroyal tea for what the narratives politely call female complaints.
And we really need to dig into the how and why of pennyroyal, because this is where the medicine becomes an astonishing tool of resistance.
It really is.
Because pennyroyal is an abortifacient.
Exactly. And when you consider that the enslavers viewed enslaved women as livestock to be bred to increase their capital.
It's horrific. An enslaved woman's reproductive system was not her own.
Right. So by utilizing pennyroyal, these healers were actively managing reproductive health.
They were helping women reclaim the means of reproduction and resist forced breeding.
That isn't just healthcare. That is profound, systematic sabotage of the plantation economy.
It is the ultimate reclamation of autonomy.
Yeah. And the way they developed this knowledge was incredibly rigorous. We often confine the concept of the scientific method to sterile laboratories with beakers and white coats.
Sure, that's the modern bias.
But the process of trial and error, rigorous observation, hypothesis testing, and outcome tracking, that is exactly what these practitioners were doing across centuries.
Yeah, the medical anthropologist Laudel Snow points out in the text that people trusted these women because they saw the survivors.
The scientific peer review process in this context was survival.
Literally. If a root was toxic or if an intervention failed, that data was immediately absorbed into the oral textbook.
The stakes were simply too high for anything less than strict pragmatism.
But you know, this complex oral textbook didn't just come over on the ships from Africa and remain static.
Oh no. The sources highlight a massive, necessary hybridization of knowledge.
Right. Because enslaved people brought what they knew from the old folks from Africa, but they found themselves in a completely new biome with unfamiliar flora.
Right, the plants were different. So they engaged in immense cultural and botanical exchange with Native Americans.
And the intersection of African and indigenous medical traditions is a vital, often ignored chapter of this history.
Completely. During the early colonial period, both African and Native American peoples were frequently enslaved together.
Forced into the same brutal labor camps, subjected to the same diseases.
The enslavers' records even utilized specific terms like mustees to categorize the children of African and indigenous parentage.
And beyond the plantations, indigenous groups like the Seminoles famously provided safe harbors and integrated escaped slaves into their communities.
Yes. Through this forced proximity and shared existential struggle, their massive ancestral knowledge bases merged.
So African healers learned the properties of New World plants from Cherokee and Seminole medicine workers.
And they mapped African spiritual concepts directly onto American flora.
I want to highlight the WPA narrative of Harriet Collins from Texas because she embodies this synthesis so proudly.
She's a fantastic example.
She told her interviewer, quote, "My mammy learned me a lots of doctrine. What she learned from old folks from Africa, and some de Indians learnt her."
She entirely claimed both heritages.
Yes. She detailed using red pepper in shoes to ward off chills, and the precise timing of harvesting red or black snake root in the spring when the sap is high.
It is a stunning testament to how marginalized cultures share their deepest secrets to ensure mutual survival.
However, we also have to face the tragic fragility of this oral transmission.
Yeah, it wasn't bulletproof.
This chain of knowledge was constantly under threat of rupture.
During the era of slavery, The option block severed the transmission instantly by tearing mothers from daughters.
But even in the 20th century, the chain faced a different kind of violence, the push for assimilation and the internalization of stigma.
Right. Younger generations were frequently taught by the broader society, and tragically, sometimes by their own families seeking to protect them from racist caricatures, to be deeply ashamed of these rural folk roots.
Which brings us to a heartbreaking account in the text about a modern woman named Shirley.
Shirley's story is the perfect example of how this knowledge is lost.
It really is. She grew up with an innate, deep interest in herbalism, which she attributed to her grandmother, Susie.
And Grandma Susie was a Cherokee medicine woman.
Right. Whenever Shirley's father fell ill, Susie would travel up from Alabama, go straight into the woods, gather specific roots and barks, brew teas to draw out the sickness, and apply handcrafted poultices.
But Shirley's mother, heavily influenced by the social stigma of the mid-20th century, viewed these ancient practices with absolute dread.
She categorized all of it as voodoo.
Right, using the term as a pejorative, a marker of backwardness and danger.
She was so terrified of the social and spiritual implications that she actually forced Grandma Susie to leave their home.
The source notes that Shirley only got to visit her grandmother one time when she was 12 years old.
And her mother strictly forbade Susie from teaching the children anything whatsoever.
So as a result, generations of ancestral, rigorously tested botanical knowledge literally went into the grave with Susie.
And the tragic irony is that years later, Shirley had to pay significant amounts of money to take commercial herbalism courses from local, often white instructors just to relearn how to make basic tinctures and salves.
Knowledge that was her direct birthright, severed by fear and assimilation.
It's devastating. And that fear of being labeled superstitious or backward is still incredibly prevalent today.
Oh, definitely.
And I want to challenge you on this, actually, because as modern readers looking at these WPA narratives, we encounter remedies that test our limits.
Give me an example.
Well, Janie Landrum from Texas said that to cure a wart, you cross pins over it and hide the pins where no one can find them.
Right.
Another narrative advises that if you have a swollen kernel on your body, you go to the chimney, get a fingerful of soot, and mark a cross on the swelling.
And another man swore by carrying a penny on a string to prevent indigestion.
Yes. So if we're taking this shadow healthcare system seriously, how do we interpret marking soot on a swollen lymph node? Are we just romanticizing desperation?
It is a vital question, and it forces us back to the mechanism of healing.
Okay.
Let's examine the soot on the swollen kernel. From a purely chemical standpoint, soot, being primarily carbon, has mild historical applications as a desiccant or extremely weak antiseptic.
Sure, but that's a stretch to call it a cure.
Exactly. The chemistry is secondary. The primary mechanism is the ritual.
Just like the red rag.
Yes. A revered healer enters the space, examines the patient, and takes soot from the hearth, the literal heart and warmth of the home.
Right.
The healer marks a cross, an ancient and profoundly powerful spiritual symbol representing the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds.
So the patient, who up until that moment was isolated in pain and fear, is now enveloped in a deeply structured framework of care.
Exactly. The psychological relief of being treated by an elder who projects absolute certainty triggers a massive reduction in the body's stress response.
So we're back to psychoneuroimmunology. The ritual suppresses the cortisol, allowing the immune system to finally attack the swollen kernel.
Yes, and that is why crossing pins over a wart or carrying a penny works within this paradigm.
Even if the penny doesn't chemically alter stomach acid.
Exactly. The belief in the penny provides the psychological armor that prevents stress-induced indigestion.
These women were master practitioners of activating the body's internal healing mechanisms through belief, symbol, and community support.
But touching on the symbol of the cross brings us to the elephant in the room, the religious landscape.
Right, because Shirley's mother was terrified of the word voodoo, which points directly to the massive violent conflict between African spiritual practices and the fiercely enforced Christian society of the American South.
The enslavers aggressively pushed Christianity as a tool for docility.
So how did these healers maintain their African-derived knowledge when assimilation was mandated by the whip?
They executed one of the most brilliant cultural maneuvers in history. They hid their entire spiritual system in plain sight.
It is a massive cultural Trojan horse.
That is exactly the dynamic. In the American South, conjure, root work, and folk healing became inextricably interwoven with Protestant Christianity.
Right, because the enslavers had successfully stripped the enslaved Africans of their physical homes, their native languages, and the public names of their deities.
But they could not strip them of their cosmological framework.
No. When the enslavers handed them the Bible, expecting it to be an instruction manual for obedience and submission, the enslaved population read it through an African spiritual lens.
They looked at the Bible and saw a comprehensive manual for magic and liberation.
The Conjure Workbook details this phenomenon extensively. The author states unequivocally that in Southern root work, the Bible isn't just a book of nice parables.
No, it is the meat of conjure.
It is recognized as a tome of power.
The practitioners saw absolutely no contradiction between being a devout Christian and being a practicing root worker.
In fact, the prevailing belief was that you could not be a true, effective Southern conjure worker without the Bible.
They apply their understanding of spirit possession, herbalism, and energetic manipulation directly to the Christian tools they were given.
When they read the Old Testament, they didn't see dry historical accounts.
No, they saw a lineage of incredibly powerful two-headed root doctors.
And the undisputed master, the ultimate root doctor of the text, is Moses.
Moses is the central, towering figure in this tradition.
Because for a conjure worker, Moses wasn't just a prophet who politely asked God to intervene.
No, he was a master of high magic.
Right. Look at the Exodus narrative from their perspective. Moses approaches Pharaoh, the ultimate symbol of the enslaver.
And he doesn't just preach a sermon.
He takes a conjure stick, his shepherd's staff, and he throws it onto the ground, transforming it into a serpent that devours the serpents of Pharaoh's magicians.
He uses that same stick to physically strike the Nile, turning the water to blood.
He orchestrates plagues of frogs, boils, and total darkness.
He is actively hexing the oppressor.
And it wasn't just the stories they loved, they utilized the specific instruction.
Yeah, the text points out that in the book of Leviticus, God gives Moses a recipe to purify a leper, instructing him to use cedar wood, hyssop, and a living bird.
And to a modern reader, that's just an archaic ritual.
But to a 19th century root worker, that is a direct divine recipe for a spiritual bath and an uncrossing ritual hiding right there in the scripture.
Moses used both hands to set his people free.
He conquered the enemies, he removed magical blocks, and he performed massive reversal work.
The Conjure Workbook even provides instructions, rooted in this tradition, on how to craft your own conjure stick inspired by Moses.
Yeah, the practitioner finds a specific tree limb, strips the bark, lets it cure.
And every single day, they call on the spirit of Moses to fill the wood with power.
They craft a holy oil from olive oil while continuously praying Psalm 23, and they dress the stick for 21 days to activate it.
So they were weaponizing the Psalms. They were using them as literal spells.
The Psalms were the most highly practical tools in the kit. They were applied technology.
Wow. So if a woman needed protection from a violent overseer, or if she needed to clear a path for a family member trying to escape, she didn't just read a psalm passively.
No, she prayed it continuously while making a physical floor wash out of ammonia and Florida water to cleanse the energy of her physical space.
The words of the Bible provided what one forward writer describes as the voltage to power the wiring of the herbal recipes.
The ingenuity is staggering. The oppressors observed the enslaved population singing hymns and fervently reading the Bible, and they thought, perfect, we've won. They are assimilated.
But inside the very framework of the Southern Protestant Church, an ancient, subversive, fiercely empowering African spiritual system was operating fully undetected.
When they sang Go Down Moses, they weren't just singing a nice biblical tune.
No, they were issuing a direct magical invocation of a liberator spirit who possessed the specific knowledge to hex an enslaver.
And they mapped this framework onto numerous biblical figures.
Like Elijah.
Yes, they looked at the prophet Elijah calling down fire from the sky to defeat the priests of Baal, and they recognized a master of reversal work and divine justice.
And they looked at Joshua bringing down the impregnable walls of Jericho through coordinated sound and movement.
And they saw the ultimate unblocking ritual. Practitioners would literally walk around a candle counterclockwise, mimicking Joshua's march, praying to dismantle whatever forces were holding them down.
They even repurposed the Song of Solomon for love work, combining his verses about honey and lilies with physical ingredients like syrup and magnetic lodestones to draw a lover toward them.
It's brilliant. But while many women in the rural Protestant South had to execute this brilliant Trojan horse strategy, hiding their practices within Protestantism, there was one location in America where the unique cultural environment allowed women to step entirely outside those
A
restrictions.
place where they didn't just practice in the shadows.
Right, they built a highly visible, absolute matriarchy,
We are, of course, talking about the cultural anomaly of New Orleans.
the Crescent City. Let's delve into the Queens of New Orleans and the complex reality of voodoo.
Yeah, but before we go further, we have to dismantle the pop culture bastardization of the word voodoo.
Oh, definitely. The text jambalaya is crucial here for reclaiming the term.
Right. The author meticulously explains that the word voodoo originates from the Fon and Yu languages of West Africa.
And it roughly translates to life principle, genius, and spirit.
It has absolutely nothing to do with Hollywood demonic pacts or sticking pins in dolls to hurt people.
Exactly. In the specific environment of New Orleans, voodoo evolved into an incredibly adaptable, open-ended system described by the author as a spicy dish with many fine ingredients.
It is the ultimate spiritual gumbo.
It synthesized African ancestor reverence, Native American earth worship, and heavy elements of European Christian occultism.
And what makes the history of voodoo in Louisiana so structurally fascinating is its leadership.
The text is incredibly blunt about this dynamic. It states, quote, "Voodooism seems to have been a matriarchy almost from its first days in Louisiana."
It explicitly notes that the voodoo king was always a minor figure.
Right. To quote the source, Papa didn't count. Mama was the entire show.
Over 80% of the cultists and practitioners were women.
So why did New Orleans foster an environment where these women could become actual public figures of authority queens when women almost everywhere else in the country were forced into hiding?
It requires an understanding of the unique geopolitical and demographic history of New Orleans.
Right. Unlike the Protestant English colonies on the eastern seaboard, New Orleans was shaped by French and Spanish rule before the Louisiana Purchase.
Which resulted in a vastly different legal and social structure regarding race, slavery, and manumission.
It fostered a large, highly influential population of free people of color.
Furthermore, it was a massive port city that saw constant influxes of immigrants and Caribbean refugees.
Most notably, those fleeing the Haitian Revolution, bringing incredibly potent strains of African Caribbean spirituality with them,
And crucially, it was a Catholic city.
which provides a much easier bridge for syncretism.
Yeah, because if a population is already accustomed to lighting candles to St. Michael or leaving offerings for St. Jude, it is a very short, logical step to light a candle to Ogun or Cecily.
Exactly. Catholicism's veneration of saints and use of elaborate ritual tools provided a perfect overlay for African polytheistic and animistic traditions.
Whereas strict Protestantism, which stripped away iconography and physical ritual, offered far fewer places to hide.
In this chaotic, bawdy, deeply stratified but porous environment, the voodoo queens emerged as central figures of immense social authority.
Long before the most famous queen took power, the sources described the massive public rituals at Lake Pontchartrain, led by early queens like Sanité Dédé and Marie Salope.
The descriptions of those scenes are cinematic.
Oh, completely. You have to picture hundreds of people gathered at the lake.
The women are wearing elaborate five-point tignons.
And we should clarify what a tignon is, because it is a perfect microcosm of resistance culture.
Yes. In 1786, the colonial governor passed the Tignon laws, essentially mandating that women of color must wrap their hair.
The goal was to suppress their beauty and enforce their lower social status so they wouldn't compete with white women.
But what did these women do?
They took the mandate and turned it into high fashion.
They used vibrant silks, jewels, and feathers to fold the scarves into elaborate crowns.
So you have these women wearing crowns forged from oppressive laws, dancing around a candlelit vever, which is a complex geometrical symbol drawn in red brick dust on the ground to act as a beacon to call the spirits down.
They are eating congres of baladi, a sacred dish of black-eyed peas and rice-drinking tafia, potent sugarcane alcohol.
And moving to the relentless booming polyrhythms of bamboo drums and gourd rattles.
And the texts point out that they are singing Creole songs that were not just spiritual chants.
No, they were highly political broadcasts.
They were openly ridiculing the corrupt political figures of the city, and subtly, or sometimes very overtly, calling for slave insurrections.
These gatherings weren't just church services, they were covert political rallies and community organizing events orchestrated entirely by women of color.
And the historical figure who eventually harnesses all of this chaotic, decentralized energy and institutionalizes it is the legendary Mamselle Marie Laveau.
Marie Laveau is arguably one of the most mythologized women in American history.
She is a figure of monumental historical importance. But as the author of Jambalaya insists, we must cut through the centuries of sensationalist mythology.
Right. She was not a benevolent saint, and she was certainly not a demonic witch.
She was, in the author's precise words, simply a woman who responded appropriately to the demands of her time with the resources available to her.
She was a profound, ruthlessly effective social and cultural engineer.
How exactly did she engineer a society? Because she wasn't just operating a small clinic in the woods.
No, she was operating right in the bustling center of a major American city, deeply entangled with the city's elite.
She engineered her power by centralizing and standardizing the spiritual practice, and then marrying it to political leverage.
She looked at the wildly diverse, often competing practices of the Nago, Fon, Igbo, and Congo worshippers across the city and created a unified, cohesive system.
She established standardized protocols.
Mm-hmm.
Friday night became the official altar night. St. John's Eve became the massively attended annual ritual.
She centralized the distribution of the materials, dispensing the specific candles, the dolls, and the conjure bags.
But her true genius was her political and religious integration.
Right. She wove voodoo into the Catholic Church so effectively that the St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter reportedly became the most highly integrated church in the state.
Known, practicing voodooists were openly receiving Catholic sacraments.
She essentially forced the dominant religious institution to accommodate her power.
She created a monopoly on spiritual authority. But we have to address a highly complex, often uncomfortable part of her history that the text brings up.
You mean the plaquage system?
Yes. The sources state that Laveau operated extensively as a procuress for quadroon balls, deeply navigating a system known as plaquage.
And this is a topic that can be very difficult for a modern reader to parse without imposing our current moral frameworks. How does the text guide us to understand this?
The text demands that we look at it objectively, entirely within the brutal context of 19th century New Orleans.
Okay.
This was a deeply compromised, racist, and fiercely patriarchal world where women of color had virtually no legal rights, no access to formal generational wealth, and were constantly violently vulnerable.
And the plaquage system was an established societal arrangement where wealthy white men would officially court and secure long-term financial contracts and physical houses for young, free women of color.
Right. And the text notes that as a procuress, acting as a surrogate mother figure or broker, Mademoiselle Laveau secured many highly advantageous financial arrangements for her clients.
So to use a modern mechanical metaphor, she wasn't just a spiritual leader, she was operating an intricate social protection racket.
That is an incredibly accurate way to view it. It was a brutal survival tactic.
Because in a rigged society where spiritual terror and blackmail were sometimes the only currencies the white patriarchy actually respected, Laveau used every ounce of her leverage.
She used her unparalleled network of informants, the enslaved servants working in the homes of the white elite who fed her their deepest secrets, combined with her terrifying spiritual authority to extract resources from the white patriarchy.
And then she redistributed those resources, money, housing, legal protection, to secure the physical safety and economic survival of the young women in her community and their future children.
It is the ultimate, unapologetic manifestation of resistance culture.
It is not pretty, it does not fit into a neat moral box, but it is raw survival.
She realized the rules of the game were designed to destroy her people, so she exploited the fears and desires of the oppressors to make herself completely untouchable.
And that profound autonomy is precisely why her memory endures so powerfully today.
It is why, over a century later, people still journey to her crypt in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1.
They draw the 4 intersecting marks and leave offerings of silver coins, pound cake, and red brick dust.
She represents a level of female autonomy, strategic brilliance, and uncompromising power that was entirely unparalleled in her era.
Wow. As we pull all of these incredible historical threads together, a breathtaking picture emerges.
It really does.
We started with the quiet, devastatingly effective, everyday resistance of a grandmother in a rural cabin, expertly boiling sassafras root and sweeping her yard in a specific pattern to maintain a boundary of safety.
We trace that divine mother wit through the hands of the midwives, who simultaneously delivered babies and managed the psychological survival of an entire people.
We saw root doctors weaponizing the Psalms of Moses to magically dismantle chains.
And we ended up in the bawdy, dangerous streets of New Orleans, where a voodoo queen masterfully orchestrated the social and economic fabric of a major city.
What unites every single one of these women across decades and geographies is that they were the undisputed foundational preservers of African American healing and knowledge.
They absolutely refused to be reduced to mere units of labor.
They utilized a deeply rigorous, holistic mindset, understanding that you cannot separate the health of the body from the health of the spirit, the cohesion of the community, and the rhythms of the earth.
They used that holistic understanding to actively heal the immense trauma of a displaced, brutalized people.
Without their mother wit, without their botanical science and spiritual labor, these communities simply would not have survived.
And that brings us directly to you, the listener.
Yes, it is vital to recognize the deep, often completely unacknowledged debt that modern society and modern medicine owes to the resilience and the genius of these women.
We are currently living in an era where alternative holistic medicine is experiencing a massive, highly profitable resurgence.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Yet the true history of the marginalized women who preserved these exact modalities is almost always erased from the marketing.
Exactly. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought on that.
Okay, let's hear it.
Consider the massive, multi-billion-dollar modern wellness industry today. If you scroll through social media or walk into a high-end boutique pharmacy, you are bombarded with promotions for holistic health, energy clearing, herbal cleanses, and the mind-body connection. Yet, the pristine aesthetic marketing of this industry entirely erases the foundational, incredibly dangerous, and sacred labor of the Black and Indigenous women who developed and preserved these exact philosophies.
They didn't practice holistic health as a lifestyle trend.
No, they preserved this knowledge at the cost of their own safety, hiding it inside Bibles, masking it as domestic chores, and passing it down in whispered apprenticeships from grandmother to granddaughter.
So the next time you brew a cup of chamomile tea to calm your nervous system, or you purchase an expensive herbal tincture to balance your energy, take a moment.
Yes, ask yourself, whose ancestors' mother wit are you actually borrowing?